Peter Andreas here from Watson Institute and the Political Science Department. I'm the point person on the security program here at the Institute, and we have a security seminar series, and this is our first seminar of the new semester, and I'm very happy to welcome James Rahn from the University of Minnesota to give us a talk on his very collaborative multi-year project on public trust in human rights NGOs amidst intense violence. Jim Rahn is the Stassen Chair of International Affairs at University of Minnesota and is a joint employee between the Humphrey School and the Political Science Department. He's also consulted with Human Rights Watch, ICRC, and CARE. He also, most importantly, and from my perspective, was a former Watson postdoc. Did the math 18 years ago. Time flies. Jim also is admirably someone who's managed to, I'd say, reinvent himself multiple times over the years. He got his PhD in sociology, but he's now in a political science department and at a public policy school. So he transferred from sociology to a policy school, and now a joint appointment between a policy school and political science. And before he even became an academic, he actually worked for Human Rights Watch, I believe. So he's obviously one source of continuity is an interest in human rights issues. Another reinvention is he started out very much as a qualitative social scientist, and as you'll see from his presentation, I told him not to give you too much overwhelming data and spreadsheets, but he's now really gone on the other side, the dark side, and is now a fully quantitative person doing large N studies with lots of data and polling from all over the surveys from multiple continents with a research team in different countries. So I look forward to hearing about that project. Please help me welcome Jim back to the Watson Institute.
Thank you, Peter. It's a pleasure to be here. This type doesn't seem to be that obvious, huh? Can we dim the... Oh, wow. That's very impressive. Well, no, that was better the way it was. Let's go back down again. Okay. Ah, okay, that's good. All right, and now I can see who's on their phone. So, Janice, please put your phone away. It's a pleasure to be here. As Peter said, I had a postdoc here 18 or 19 years ago, but it was a postdoc, but I actually hadn't finished my dissertation yet, so it was a pre-post. And then I presented this study early parts of it about 10 years ago, and it was not to my liking, so I kept going, and 10 years later I hope I have a much better study. So I'm delighted to be here today. This is a project that I'm working on with my co-authors, David Crow at the university called CIDE in Mexico City. He's our polling expert. And then with Shannon Golden and Archana Pandya, two colleagues who've done a lot of the travel. As you'll see from the presentation, there's a lot of coordination and international travel involved. And I have two young kids, and so I don't do that so much myself, but they've been wonderful at that. So I'm very grateful to them. And this is part of something we call the Human Rights Organizations Project, which I direct at the University of Minnesota. We do research, we do consulting for NGOs, and we also run something called Open Global Rights, which is a website that's hosted by Open Democracy in London. It has about 500,000 unique visitors per month. Our piece of the website, Open Global Rights, is in 20 different languages. With support from the Ford Foundation, we run a series of debates between scholars and practitioners from all over the world about human rights strategies and capacities. So I invite you all to take a look at that website. We've been very lucky to get funding also from the Open Society Foundation, which is funding the next wave of my research, which I'll talk about at the end of the presentation. What is the global context within which this talk takes place? As many of you may know, there's something going on called a clampdown on civil society. Here you see an article by your own illustrious alumni, Ken Roth, who's now the head of Human Rights Watch and has been for 25 years, in which he's releasing their latest annual report 2015, which the theme of which is this clampdown on civil society. According to Civicus, a group based in South Africa that tracks this kind of thing, about 96 countries around the world have passed legislation in the last 10 years restricting the activities of human rights groups and of NGOs in general around the world. In research that myself and colleagues are doing, we've tracked the restrictions on foreign aid to local civil society since 1993. And whereas before 1993, only 6 countries of all the countries in the world had a restriction on the books that regulated and restricted the extent to which foreigners could fund local civil society. Now, between 1993, 45 countries placed restrictions, and only 5 loosened their restrictions. And since 2012, there's been about 6 more. Some of the famous cases that I'm sure many of you know are Russia, with what's called a foreign agent law. You have to label yourself a foreign agent if you receive funding from overseas in Russia, and the Open Society Foundations has been blocked from operating in Russia. Egypt is a very famous case. Ethiopia is a famous case. I grew up in Israel, and Israel is now passing a very similar law. And if it passes, it will be very similar to the Russian law. Anyone who works in a kind of a liberal or left-wing NGO that receives money from overseas will have to wear a badge that identifies them as a foreign agent. And when they pick up the phone, they'll have to say, "Hello, this is Jim Rohn, foreign agent speaking." And it's a really quite a draconian law. But this is a global phenomenon. In India, Greenpeace was shut down for a while. NGOs across the world are feeling great pressure from governments. And so one of the questions that I want to ask, and that human rights activists want to ask, and international relations scholars want to ask is, what does this mean? What's going on? Why should we care? Well, we should care. If you're a scholar of international relations, you should care because you know that almost all of the liberal theories that we have in international relations talk about the importance of local civil society in general, and local rights-inclined civil society in particular, for the strengthening of international human rights norms, or for the promotion of international human rights. For example, Beth Simmons, up the road at Harvard University, wrote this massive statistical study of international human rights law. And she said, as best she can discern from the data that she's collected, and it's the best piece of work we have to date, international human rights law really only matters when local champions engage with it and try and push it forward. Otherwise, it doesn't really seem to stick. States may sign on, they may sign international human rights treaties, but it doesn't really seem to matter. She can't pick up any discernible impact in the data unless there's engagement from local activists. Kekin Senkik, if any of you know that, it's a classic in the field, published in 1997, made a similar point about the importance of activists. Unlike Beth Simmons, they stressed the importance of transnational activists. But if you read the book carefully, you realize that all the transnational activists that they're talking about are nourished and inspired and kicked off by local activists. The information that transnational activists amplify and use in the media, in the international media and in international reporting and at the UN and so forth, all comes from local activists. Janice Gallagher, your postdoc, and I were just talking earlier today about the importance of that information from local activists, and she noted that a lot of local activists tend to get a little bit irritated with the way the internationals swoop in, kind of extract their information and data, and then go off and amplify it around the world and receive a lot of the credit. And that's another topic, that relationship. But the important point is that without that local input, it's very hard for transnational activists to do anything. A fellow named Cliff Bob wrote a wonderful book in 2005. Is there ringing? Do you hear ringing? That's just me. Okay. In 2005, Cliff Bob wrote a great book. And he talked about the legitimacy of international NGOs. He talked about Amnesty International and Greenpeace, and he said, these groups actually have no legitimacy in the international arena unless they have a strong partnership with a local organization. That local organization gives them access, gives them information, gives them credibility, gives them the ability to make claims in the international arena that they represent anyone. In fact, if you think about it, Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch's claim to make representations on the part of those who need their help around the world rests very much on their ability to cite individual partners, organizations that have asked for their help and have called on them to give support. Shireen Hertel, down the road at University of Connecticut, wrote a wonderful book called Unexpected Power, in which she showed that dependence of international NGOs on the legitimacy from local NGOs give those local NGOs often great power in internal negotiations within transnational networks. Her case study of India and of Mexico was very illuminating in that respect. Amanda Murdy, a young scholar of international relations who's producing, seems to be about 4 high-quality articles a year at extraordinary pace, she shows that international human security interventions require local participation in order to succeed. And again, like Beth Simmons, she shows that statistically in a very rigorous manner. And finally, Emily Hafner-Burton, noted IR scholar out at UC San Diego, has just written a book about the importance of what she calls global stewardship for human rights. Her argument is that a small club of powerful democracies must are doing this now and must continue to do so to get together and to promote human rights around the world. It's not the UN, it's not the European Union, it has to be individual states, like France, like the United States, like the UK. And while you may or may not subscribe to that notion of the US being a rights-promoting state, what's important for me is that she has several chapters in her book, which is focused on states, noting that those states will never be successful unless there's local uptake from local NGOs. But it's not just the liberals who talk a lot about NGOs. It's also the critical theorists. David Kennedy, who used to be here as your director, is one of the major proponents of this notion that human rights NGOs and human rights universalism is in fact a false kind of universalism. And really what's going on is some kind of neo-colonial intellectual imperialism, activist imperialism. And he's joined by very famous scholars in what's called the TWAIL theory, TWAIL area of research, third world approaches to international law, such as Mikhail Motua. Stephen Hopgood is an international relations theorist who makes this argument. And they all basically say that human rights is a form of soft imperialism. And there's a sophisticated post-colonial philosophical argument that goes along with this, which is very important to engage with. Another group of scholars tend to be a bit more Marxist, or Dependencistas, argue that NGOs, especially in Africa, are what's called the new compradors. That is, they're, like in the colonial times, there was the comprador classes who interface between global capitalism or Western capitalism and local extraction. NGOs occupy that same niche where they kind of make global empire palatable for the locals and render the locals up to the global empire. It's a complicated argument, but it's an intriguing one. And finally, a human rights stalwart named Lucia Nader has put forth the argument in the last year or two from her perspective in Brazil that says this wave of protests that's been sweeping the Spanish-speaking and Portuguese-speaking world and other parts of the world too, Syriza, the Podemos demonstrations, the march in Brazil is a cry against the establishment that failed the electorate and failed ordinary people in the 2008 financial crisis, and that human rights NGOs are part of that establishment, and that people are out on the streets protesting against human rights NGOs as part of the ruling establishment. That NGOs have become corrupted, they've become salaried bureaucrats, and NGOs have betrayed their revolutionary promise and are now part of the problem. And this is a very common charge in India, as I'm sure Patrick knows, that's been arguments that have been raging among Marxists and others in India for quite some years. Now this argument is spreading more internationally. So human rights NGOs are getting it both from the extreme left and also from the right. What do we actually know, though, about the relationship between NGOs and the local population? You notice that all of these claims, the liberal theorists and the critical theorists, rest on an inferred relationship between populations and NGOs. In reality, we don't know very much. We know from a series of case studies done mostly by Latin American scholars that there's a pessimistic argument, an optimistic argument. Catherine Sinking, Alison Brisk, and others argue that NGOs are the true voices of the people. That when you want to know what the people think and what the people need, you turn to local NGOs, and they will tell you what the people need. And then there's the pessimistic argument put forth most recently by critical anthropologists in Africa and elsewhere, such as Harry England, who wrote the searing critique of human rights NGOs in Malawi, that argues that human rights are elites, they're urban elites that are status-seeking, status-hungry, rapacious overlords. They're just, I mean, the picture he paints in his book called Prisoners of Freedom is just so appalling, so dismal. It makes you so sad to read this. You're like, oh my God, these are human rights people? These are the scum of the earth. And he writes this book and it just makes you just feel horrendous after you read it. You feel dirty. And he relies obviously on case studies too. He's an anthropologist. As I was reading all this stuff over the last 10 years, I realized we actually don't have very much information, however, that's systematic. We have a couple cases. We have a case from Latin America here, a case from Africa there, but we don't actually have any systemic information that looks at public attitudes towards human rights NGOs across time and across space. We don't actually know what the public thinks about human rights NGOs. Everybody thinks they know because they have an opinion and their friends have an opinion, but we don't actually know what really large sectors of the population think and how that varies across population segments. What drives those attitudes? And so I decided to collect some evidence. I was lucky enough to be able to get access to some resources through my new position at the University of Minnesota. And so the first thing we did was a series of key informant interviews. We interviewed 128 human rights workers from 60 countries, and we asked them what they thought the public thought of them. Then we went to 4 different countries and conducted 135 face-to-face interviews with human rights leaders. These were representative samples of 6 cities in 4 different countries: Nigeria, Morocco, India, and Mexico. And we got lists of all the NGOs we could find, about 60 to 70 in each city, and then sampled 55% of those NGOs to get a representative sample of LHRO, local human rights organization leaders. And we asked them, what do you think people think about you? And that's where I was going to stop and write the book. But then I got these new resources, so I said, let's go out and collect even more information. So we went out and collected 6,100 face-to-face surveys with populations in those 4 countries, and asked them a series of questions. And the questionnaire is about 35 minutes long. And we worked with survey companies, and we systematically probed across adult populations what they thought of human rights organizations. What groups am I talking about? Human rights organizations is a kind of a mushy word. Who exactly are we? What exactly do I mean? I conceive of human rights promotion in the Global South as kind of a tiered structure with 5 different groups. At the top are international donors, such as USAID or the Department of International Development in the UK, and they provide a lot of the funding for human rights activities. Beneath them are international NGOs, such as Oxfam or CARE or Human Rights Watch or Amnesty. Some of them take government money and then repackage it and redistribute it to the Global South. Some of them take money from private donors, like Human Rights Watch, for example, doesn't accept any government money. Beneath them are the group that I'm talking about, what I call Tier 3. These are the larger NGOs that are typically based in capital cities or in major cities, major towns, and they have an explicit human rights mandate. There may be a few people there who worked internationally, but most of the people are nationals. If you know who Sidney Taro is, he calls these embedded transnationalists, right? What's this? Isn't that his term, embedded transnationals? He's like, they're people who have a face to the outside world. Rooted cosmopolitans, yes, rooted cosmopolitans, thank you. They have a face to the outside world, but they are rooted in their own societies. They're not foreigners. And then beneath them are different types of organizations, which we can talk about later, that are much smaller, less formal, they have smaller budgets, and they may not be as explicitly human rightsy as level 3. And they could be community organizations, could be organizations working on behalf of prisoners, they could be organizations working on behalf of people with HIV/AIDS, and they might be in more distant parts of the country. They're not in the capital city, per se. So I'm mostly talking about these Tier 3 organizations. So this is our sampling strategy. This is how we went out and gathered the data. First in Mexico, this is our case selection, as you'll see, the case selection strategy is something we call in political science most different case selection strategy. That is, you sample from a bunch of cases that differ substantially on important characteristics, and you hope that if you find something common between them, that this indicates that something is global maybe is going on, something that at least it's not just limited to these 4 countries. If 4 very different countries reveal the same attitudes towards human rights organizations, then this is likely not just an artifact of that one individual country, of just that one individual region. Right? One of the problems we've had is there have been these individual case studies of in Latin America and Argentina, or of Uruguay, or of Malawi, but we're always wondering, is this an African thing? Is this a Malawi thing? Well, by having a strategy that looks at 4 different countries that differ in substantial ways, if we find any similarities, we're excited, because that means that might be more than just those 4 countries. It might even be a broader global trend. And so we very purposefully selected countries that vary by world region, by their major religion, by their colonial history, by what Samuel Huntington called civilization, and by their major languages. Because there's a theory for each one of these that says that the language or the colonial history should have these long-term post-colonial effects that shape the political characteristics of the country. And so we try to vary across those big factors. And this is the polling strategy that we used. They're face-to-face polls, which if you're into the polling world, you know that's increasingly out of fashion. Most of the polls done in this country are either phone or computer-based. Computer-based is now becoming very common in places like India and elsewhere in the developing world. I don't still feel comfortable with computer-based. I think internet penetration is too limited. So I prefer face-to-face. Face-to-face, however, is very expensive. Each one of these surveys costs in the region of $30,000 to $40,000, and that's just the survey costs. That's not the travel and the analysis and so forth. But nonetheless, we chose to do face-to-face surveys. In Mexico, our sample size was 2,400 because we were able to attach ourselves to an ongoing survey done by another group. It's called omnibusing, when you insert your questions into somebody else's survey. And there I worked with CIDE, the Mexican university, which does a biannual poll. But in Morocco, Nigeria, and India, we did our own freestanding surveys. We found a survey company, we worked with them very closely. We then went into the field and we trained with them. We helped them do the sampling strategy, and we were with them at all stages of the process. In Morocco, we did Rabat, Casablanca, and small towns within a 70-kilometer radius around those two cities. In Nigeria, we did Lagos and the rural areas around Lagos. And in India, we did Mumbai and the rural areas of Maharashtra state. And so in all cases, our samples are representative of the adult population in that city, plus the rural areas, and we did a rural oversample so that we would be able to make statistical comparisons. So what did we find? Well, to know why what we found is interesting, we not only want to know about the theory, we also want to know what human rights leaders themselves say. And the human rights leaders themselves say that things are really bad. Most of the human rights leaders said that in my country, human rights is very hard for ordinary people to understand and to connect to. Significant numbers said that the public views them as agents of foreigners. And this is the government rhetoric in so many different countries. Many believe that the public considers them supporters of criminals or terrorists. And this is particularly important for the topic of this series, which is intense violence, because in all the countries all those 4 countries we're talking about, there is major ongoing violence, either by criminals or as people designated as terrorists. And there's a great fear on the part of human rights groups that the government and the media and that the public in general considers them to be supporters of those enemies of the state. And so Mexican groups, for example, told us, Mexico has had over 100,000 deaths in the last 8 years due to the drug war. Mexican human rights groups feel that the public is uniformly against them, seeing them as protectors of rats. Rats is the Mexican slang for criminals. And in India, a lot of human rights groups, especially if they're associated with the Muslim community, feel that they're being thought of as defenders of Islamic terrorists. The same is true in Morocco, which has been struck by a wave of terrorism since the 2000s. And the government has cracked down on a number of human rights organizations, arguing that somehow they're creating sympathy and support for Islamist terrorists. And in Nigeria, of course, racked by the Boko Haram menace, human rights groups often feel that they're being perceived of as somehow tacit allies of Boko Haram because they're calling for the rule of law. So in all of these cases, human rights groups feel that by saying that the government needs to behave according to the rules of the road, they have to behave according to international human rights law, that they're being regarded as enemies of the state, as allies of the terrorists, allies of the criminals, or in some cases as allies of the CIA. That's a very common allegation. And human rights groups also believe, the human rights group leaders also believe that their real support comes from the urban and the higher educated, which is what, if I had to poll you, I would guess that most of you would say is probably true, that it's the urban, cosmopolitan, upper middle class that maybe sends their kids overseas, maybe themselves have gone overseas for education. Those are the people who support human rights groups. This is what we went into the poll expecting to find. So what did we actually find? Turns out that the human rights leaders couldn't be more wrong. The public feels about them very differently than they think. But not only were the human rights leaders wrong, I was fundamentally wrong. If anybody knows my prior work, I've been doing this now for almost 20 years, I'm a human rights supporter who's always very skeptical. I always write articles that say, human rights is a great idea, but you know what? It's not really penetrating very deeply, and ordinary people don't like human rights groups, and they really are kind of foreign agents, and they really are kind of compradors. I was in the critical camp. I said it more softly than David Kennedy did, and I said it more softly than some of the other critical scholars, but I was very skeptical. I grew up in Israel, where actually polls show that human rights groups are thought of that way. So Israel's kind of an outlier. But I was very skeptical. I was a human rights worker and a human rights defender, but I felt like we were like most human rights leaders, I thought that we were largely alone, largely an elite that was only supported by a few other cosmopolitans, and that ordinary people were very much opposed to us. I was very pessimistic. I was in the pessimistic camp. And so for all of my academic life and for the first 10 years of this, first 5 years of this 10-year project, I was a pessimist. But then the survey findings started rolling in, and I was blown away. First, I was not wrong in that contact with human rights organizations is indeed very, very low. So we asked our representative samples, have you ever met a human rights group? Do you ever hear about human rights group? Could you name a human rights group? Have you ever participated in human rights groups' activities? And as you see here, the numbers are low. Only 8% on average has met a human rights worker. Only 7% said that they thought they could name a human rights organization. When we then asked them what that organization was, far fewer could actually do that. And only 5% said that they had ever in their life participated in anything that they thought might be a human rights activity. And we don't know if it actually was a human rights organization activity. It could have been a march of another kind. But only 5% thought that they had ever been close to that. So those numbers are really low. Let me just explain, because it's important for the rest of the presentation. The black is the average, and then the different colors are the individual countries. Okay, so the black is the average, and we show you the average here, and that's the black bar. But then we ask them, okay, so your personal experiences aside, what do you actually think of these groups? And that's a reasonable question, right? I mean, none of us probably have met President Obama, but we all have some views about him, right? And none of us have met Trump, but I'm sure we all have strong views about him. You can have views about things that you don't meet. That's perfectly normal. That's what politics is all about, right? It's about sending a message and creating reputations. So we ask, in your opinion, how strongly do you associate the following phrase with the term human rights? We translate that into multiple languages. And the scale is 1, I associate this least strongly, with 7, I associate it most strongly. And then we asked a bunch of different phrases. 4 is neutral, and that's important. So first we started with some positive things. To what extent do you associate protecting women's rights with human rights? To what extent do you associate protecting people from torture and murder with human rights? Socioeconomic justice or promoting free and fair elections? And all the responses to those, the averages and almost all the individual countries, were in the positive side. That is, they were beyond 4. Anything between 4 and 7 is, yes, I do associate that term with human rights. And anything to the left of the line of 4 is I don't associate, right? Because 4 is the neutral. So we see that, on average, people associate human rights with those positive things. And not only that, they associate both the social and economic rights and the civil and political rights. There's a huge debate in the scholarly community about which is more important, economic and social, political, civil, which comes first. In the ordinary person's mind, the two are very closely linked. And in fact, the correlation between economic, social, and civil and political is at 0.45, which my survey colleagues tell me in attitudinal data is a very high correlation. And factor analysis, for those of you interested in the statistics, show that indeed there's an underlying single factor that underlies protecting people from torture and murder, socioeconomic justice, and free and fair elections. That is a remarkable finding if you have tracked the human rights debate over the last 30 years. More importantly, there is really no support for the idea that human rights is a foreign thing. In all 4 of the countries, no matter how different they were in terms of their civilization, their colonial history, their religion, and so forth and so on, the averages did not think that human rights was about promoting foreign ideas or promoting US interests. Now, you could say, yeah, but in these responses, people aren't really telling you what they really think. There's a lot of social desirability response, it's called. You say what you think you're supposed to say. If that was true, however, the patterns would not be similar across countries. Unless you were to think that people in Morocco and in India both think that it's socially desirable not to say something or to say something. And that's just not the case. These are profoundly different countries. And so despite all these differences, all the countries, to a lesser or greater extent, do not think that human rights is about foreign promotion of interests or values. This, in the human rights world, is amazing. Every single human rights worker thinks to a certain extent that they are promoting ideas that people don't support because they're foreign or they're CIA plot or something like that. and we simply did not find that in the data systematically. Now, I'm just showing you 4 countries. We have 7 other countries where we're collecting data, and we don't find it there either. But I'm working on these 4 countries today. And then we asked the nasty stuff. How much do you associate it with doing nothing, not promoting anyone's interests, not protecting anyone's interests? How much do you associate it with protecting criminals? And how much do you associate it with protecting terrorists? And the scores are all strongly negative, in the 2.4, 2.5 range, 2.9 for one of them. That everything under 4 means no, I do not associate that term. So the reputational brand of human rights across these 4 countries is actually really strong. This may not seem like a big deal to you sitting here at Brown University, but if you do human rights anywhere else in the world, you are amazed by this. And so when I show this stuff, donors and human rights groups are just like, whoa, are you sure you checked those numbers? They do it again. Are you sure you didn't flip the signs? They check it again. And we have checked because we didn't believe it. But we checked and checked and rechecked, and these are indeed the findings. Next, we wanted to ask, how much do you trust human rights organizations? Because maybe the associations are good, but still people don't trust the NGOs themselves. Maybe they think those NGOs really are kind of working for the bad guys, for criminals, for terrorists, for foreign agents, but they think human rights is clean, but the actual groups are bad. In the book, we distinguish between what we call the word and the messenger. So maybe people think the word of human rights is fine, but they distrust the messengers. So we asked on a 4-point scale, and we rescale it here to 0 to 1, because in one of the countries we did another scale as a test. So everything is rescaled between 0 to 1. 0 means no trust at all. 1 means total trust. And this is what we see. I'm giving you here trust in 6 different institutions: religious institutions, local human rights groups, general population, US government, multinational corporations, and politicians. Remember, the black line is the average. So clearly, politicians in their own country are the least trusted across all 4 countries. Their score is about 0.3, 3.1. The most trusted institution on average is religious institutions. And that's true across all 4 countries. The effective range of trust is between 0.31 and 0.64. That is, on average, the lowest trust is given to politicians, and that's at 0.31. So that's the floor, that's the trust floor of most people on average. And the highest trust they give is 0.64, and that's to religious institutions. So your effective range is between 0.3 and 0.6. Human rights groups come in at 0.52. What that means is they're towards the upper third of the trust range. Up there, close to religious institutions and close to other good stuff, and close to the general population. US government is down towards the bottom third. Multinational corporations are also down towards the bottom third, and you'll see that that really matters in the statistical stuff that I'm going to show you in a minute. So if you combine those 2 things, average trust in human rights organizations and associations with human rights organizations, you come off with a surprisingly positive feeling. And I could stop the presentation here and we could all go home, and that's a good message. And as a result of this message, donors and funders are like, hey, could you do some more surveys in other words? Because we'd love to find that elsewhere. So that's an exciting finding, and it moved me from being a pessimist to being an optimist. It's been a very difficult 4 years. I've been really quite shaken. But now, of course, as academics, you're never content with just descriptives. You're like, okay, what actually drives trust? What are the factors? Are they socioeconomic? Is it the rich people who like it, the poor people, the highly educated, the low educated, people who are marginal, people who are voting with a political party that's in power? There's all kinds of things that could be affecting trust, right? So here are some hypotheses that we derive from the literature and from our discussions with human rights leaders. One, that human rights organizations in the popular eye are extensions of US power. If so, we would expect that mistrust in human rights groups would be correlated with mistrust in the US government. Right? The more you mistrust the US government, the more you mistrust human rights organizations, and vice versa. If human rights groups were extensions of global capitalism, which is a claim made by many, James Petras and others, in India it's a common argument, Arundhati Roy has made that argument. If that's true, then you would expect mistrust in local human rights organizations to be correlated with mistrust in multinationals. If you thought that human rights groups had become part of the ruling establishment and were just as corrupt as the bureaucrats, then your mistrust in local human rights groups would be correlated with your mistrust in domestic political authorities. And finally, if you were an optimist, like a guy called Cesar Garavito Rodriguez, who sometimes comes here and gives seminars, he works with Peter Evans, one of your senior fellows, he's a human rights activist in Colombia, you would say, no, human rights groups are counter-hegemonic. They have the support of the public that is against capitalism, that is against American imperialism, that is against the rapaciousness of their own authorities. And so if that's true, then trust in human rights organizations would be associated positively with mistrust in multinationals, US government, and the ruling authorities. And that's indeed what we find. In our statistical models, I'm going to do a statistical break here for a second. If you're not into statistics, don't worry, I'm not really either, but I can explain it to you if you need. I have people who teach me this stuff, and I can try and teach you what they taught me. The dependent variable, that is the thing we're trying to explain, is trust in local human rights organizations. Our independent variables of interest, the things that we're interested in, is mistrust in the US government, mistrust in multinationals, and mistrust in domestic political authorities. We're going to run separate models with each, but those are the things that we're interested in seeing whether they matter. And then we have a bunch of controls, because we know that all kinds of other things can shape attitudes. And so we control for socioeconomic factors like age and income. We square the income in case it's a curvilinear relationship. Rural-urban residents, recall that the anthropologists say that it's all about rural-urban stuff. We control for gender, how much you use the web, support for ruling political party, voted in the last election. Importantly, we control for average trust. I'm particularly proud of that one because I came up with that one myself. Every individual person has a propensity to trust, right? And so if I say I trust the US government this much and I trust local human rights groups this much, it could be a function of all those other things, but also just my individual propensity to trust. And not only that, every country has a certain propensity to trust. There's marked differences between countries and how much each country is trusting. So we control for that by looking at the average trust of each individual, because we asked about 15 different factors. We asked how much do you trust one of these 15 different organizations. So we averaged that and used that in our model as a control. And finally, since we took all our data from 4 countries and pooled them in one big model, we use a country-level control. That is, we take out the effects of being in India, we clean out the effects of being in Morocco, and we try and find out what the net interaction is between our independent and dependent variables of interest, controlling for country particularities. Before I show you the results, let me show you the pool of people in each country who mistrust MNCs, US government, and their own domestic authorities. 57% of the population on average mistrust the US government. That is, has a 0.49 or below on the 0 to 1 trust scale. 62% mistrust multinationals. These are your anti-globalization community. 65% mistrust their own authorities. And lest you think that these are all the same people, the overlap of all three is only 36%. So what that tells us is that there are distinct groups of people in each country. Some of them don't like the US government, some of them don't like multinationals, and some of them don't like their own authorities, but they're not the same people. Only 1/3 of them are the same people. The other 2/3 are spread out. And since all those things we're going to find are correlated with trust in local human rights groups, it means that human rights groups have actually quite a challenging communications problem on their hands, because they need to appeal to all the different communities without alienating any of them. And in further statistical models, we find that each one of these has a different sociodemographic profile. These are not the same people. Sometimes they're young, sometimes they're urban, sometimes they're rural, sometimes they're old, sometimes they're highly educated, sometimes these are different groups of people. But when you run the statistical machine and you control for everything and you run it 10,000 different ways over 2 years in coffee shops all over Mexico City, and until Starbucks coffee is coming out of your ears and you can't stand it anymore, you find this, which is controlling for everything else. When you move from a person who has low trust in the US government, multinationals, or their own domestic authorities, to a person who has high trust, your trust in local, when you move from low mistrust to high mistrust, your trust in local groups goes up. That is, the people who support local human rights groups are indeed the anti-capitalists, the anti-Americans, anti-American government, and those who are opposed to their own authorities. The effects are not huge, but they're meaningful. And if I had put what's called confidence intervals on these, you'll see that the effect of domestic political authorities is twice as large as the others. So what's really driving the result, the people who really most like their own human rights organizations are the people who mistrust their own authorities. Also, to a lesser extent, the people who mistrust the US government and the people who mistrust the multinationals. So what that means is that the critical theorists are wrong. They're wrong in this, not in the sense of what human rights groups are really doing. I don't know if human rights groups really are agents of capitalism. But they're entirely wrong in thinking that people think that they're agents of capitalism. People don't think they're agents of capitalism, people don't think they're CIA agents, and people don't think that they're working for the government. People think that they're pitched against them. They think that they are counter-hegemonic, which is what the human rights leaders wanted to think, but didn't think was true. The human rights leaders thought that everybody hated them and thought that they were shills for either for the multinationals, for George Soros, or for the CIA. It turns out that that's not true at all. The population actually does kind of like them and kind of sees them as opposed to concentrated power at the domestic and international level, be it economic or be it political. Here are a couple other key findings. Contrary to the anthropologists in Malawi who tracked human rights organizations and found that they were, to put it mildly, just real scum of the earth, systematically when you probe across those four contexts, more contact with human rights organizations leads to marginally better reputation for those human rights groups. The public, when it meets human rights groups, tends to like them. It's not a huge boost, but it's a statistically significant boost. And that's a really good news if you're either a human rights person or you are funding a human rights person. Because what Harry England, that anthropologist in Malawi, taught us was that the contact between human rights groups and ordinary people would be toxic. If you read his book, which I suggest that you do read, you will conclude from that that if human rights groups go out and they meet and greet and shake hands, the result of that will be disdain and anger and bad feelings. The human rights groups are so elitist that he talked about, so arrogant, so overweening, so self-promoting that the ordinary population would hate them. When you look at it systematically across four cases, we don't find that effect. We also find that trust in human rights groups is not driven consistently by socioeconomics. Contrary to what most people argue, there is no pro-human rights middle class. That was one of the most surprising findings. You know, there's all this talk that comes from modernization theory, and it's also kind of Marxist, that argues that as people become wealthier, they become more inclined to be interested in individual rights. Dietrich Ruschmeier, also here, has written a book that's very important along those lines. He says that bourgeois democracy expands as the middle classes expand, as the industrial classes expand, and as organized labor expands, and those are the true supporters of individual rights. We find no evidence that socioeconomic factors work in that way. In fact, we find reverse in Mumbai. In Mumbai, the middle class is the most suspicious of human rights groups, but it's the rich and the poor who are most supportive. If this is true, that totally upends all the theories that we have about the way in which the world is going to change. That as China grows, or as Brazil grows, and as the global middle class grows, that there'll be this wave of human rights support. Our findings don't suggest that that's true. The most consistent predictors are not socioeconomic, but they're attitudinal. And this is something that took me a long time to wrap my mind around. Typically, when you ask someone like my parents or friends, who supports Trump, I think a lot of you will do this too. You'll say, well, it's the white male with this income and that education, right? You try and give it a socioeconomic profile, which is what for 3 years I tried to do. Who are these supporters of human rights groups? I tried to give them a socioeconomic profile. It turns out that it doesn't really work that way. Trust in human rights groups and mistrust is spread across the population, across sociodemographic groups, and is driven by attitudes which are themselves spread across the population. So mistrust in the US cuts across different classes. Mistrust in the government cuts across different classes. And since those things are correlated with trust or mistrust in human rights groups, those cut across sociodemographics too. So there is no one sociodemographic home for the human rights groups. It's a home in multiple different places depending on which ideology you're talking about. Now, as I said, each one of those ideologies itself has some socioeconomic drivers. So if you keep regressing and regressing infinitely, you will find you're able to build a profile. But it's much more complex than saying, oh, the middle class supports human rights. And if that's true, then a lot of what human rights groups are doing is they're waging an ideological struggle for hearts and minds. They're not waging a struggle for this or that class. They're not trying to convert the middle class or convert the working class. They're engaged in a struggle about worldviews, and that has a lot of implications for how they communicate and how they organize themselves. I'll just throw in one little thing, because I find this interesting. This is another chapter in our book about religion and rights. And what you find is that populations in the 4 countries we looked at are highly, highly, highly religious. And here, the religion on a scale of 0 to 10, for example, they give it an 8.6 importance in their daily life. 85% pray at least once a day. 74% attend a religious place of worship at least once a week. There's, on average, 25% more support for religious institutions than there are for human rights organizations. Human rights practitioners, however, are much less religious than the surrounding population, remarkably so. And as a result, human rights groups tend to be quite suspicious of religious organizations. But our statistics show, I'm not going to go a lot into this now because it's kind of a side point, but I just thought I'd mention it because it's important. Our statistics show that there's a difference between the socially religious and the personally religious. People who are personally religious, that is, they pray a lot a day and they say religion is important to them, are actually quite pro-human rights. People who are socially religious, that is, they attend places of worship, tend to be much more skeptical of human rights groups. But when the socially religious have contact with human rights groups, you see this effect. The dashed line is the non-socially religious people. There's no effect of having contact. When a person who doesn't go to church meets a human rights worker, it doesn't matter for how much they trust human rights groups. But when a person who goes to church or who goes to mosque or who goes to temple regularly meets a human rights worker, that boosts their trust in the human rights group substantially. If you're a human rights group or a human rights donor, the implications are obvious. You've got to get out of the secular places and get into the religious places because it's actually, those are the people who are most suspicious of you, but when you meet them, on average, it tends to help. Okay, so what are the implications in general? Human rights groups, even in these countries with high rates of violence, criminal or terrorist or political, enjoy a lot more trust than either they or anyone else thinks. The loudest voices who are very critical of human rights groups are making a strong impression, but the silent majority appears to be far more trusting and supportive than any of us really realized. And that it is not true that human rights groups are associated either with foreigners or with terrorists or with militants or with criminals. That's a really important message because most human rights groups really think the opposite. And that the more contact human rights groups have, the better. To meet and greet actually works. To meet is to know is to trust. So expansion is actually a really good thing. And that the reputational struggle, the struggle is reputational, not socioeconomic. It's something I talked about before. What that means is that communication is an all-important thing, and anyone who knows human rights groups know that they're terrible at communication. And so this is kind of justification for donors talking a lot about the importance of building the capacity of human rights groups to communicate their message and to engage in serious discussions with this public, which appears to be far more supportive of them than they realize. So how am I taking this forward? This is a book that we're finishing up now, but how am I taking this forward? Well, Open Society came to us and they said, you know, this is really interesting. Your polls show that there's more support than any of us thought, even in this era of crackdowns on civil society. But we know that there are legal restrictions on funding. I talked about that at the beginning of the talk, that it's increasingly difficult for OSF and others to send money to local NGOs. And one of our chapters talks about this in the book. They said, is it possible for all these human rights groups, which are so dependent on foreign funds, to actually raise funds locally? So we inserted some of those questions into our surveys, and the initial results were promising. So they gave us money to do focus groups and surveys and survey experiments with 1,000 people each in Bogota and Mexico City to see whether the public might actually be willing to donate. And what I'm excited about is that there's an institutional moment here, or a moment in history, where those of us who are interested in this can take advantage of this crisis of funding, can take advantage of the fact that India is turning off foreign funding to local groups, can take advantage of the fact that Ethiopia has cut off foreign funding to local groups, and maybe push human rights groups in a different direction and say, stop going international when you look for funds, look local. There's more support than you think. It may be more possible than you know or than you believe to raise local money. And if that happens, this would be potentially an important moment in human rights history. And I'll just close with one example from from the church. There's a great article in the Review of International Studies a couple years back by Michael McGinty, in which he asked, when did African Christianity take off? And his argument was that it didn't take off until the post-colonial governments cut off flows to local churches from overseas missions and cut off the ability of foreign missionaries to work in Africa. He said 10 to 15 years after that happened, a lot of churches failed, a lot of new churches came up, and the new churches knew how to generate local passion and enthusiasm. And as a result, Christianity in Africa today is the largest growing aspect of Christianity. But his argument was, it wasn't until the foreign lifeline was cut off that there was this culling of organizations that didn't know how to raise local funds and the creation of a new class of organizational entrepreneur who knew how to appeal. And thus we have a rich and vibrant African Christianity, which is very different than the Christianity that was transmitted during the colonial period from England or from France or from the United States. So we may be at that moment in human rights where that cutoff of aid that I talked about at the beginning of the talk may be creating the conditions for an explosion of local giving, at least in some countries. Thank you.
We have a bit more than half hour for Q&A, so you want to field your own question?
Please.
Yeah, I guess it seems to me you're pretty quick to dismiss the sort of modernizationist accounts like Dietrich's, which are longitudinal accounts on the basis of data that are wholly cross-sectional. That's a comment. The question that it builds up to is, what are the class and educational backgrounds of the human rights leaders you interview?
Good question. Your first comment is right, and so as I get more money and do more surveys, we're hoping to insert some of these questions into the World Values Survey, and then we'll be able to look at this over time. I think you're right. At this point, we're just really theory building based on these 4 cases. Having said that, that's 6,100 more questions than anyone has ever asked before. The class background of the human rights leaders is interesting. 95% of them attended university, but 45% of them did not attend it in the capital city of their country. They attended it in a city or a town outside of the capital city. And only 40% of them, I think, their fathers went to university. And about 20% are their mothers. So these are well-educated, these are elites, but they're not long-time pre-colonial elites from, it's a newer class of elites. And they're not particularly wealthy. We looked into their income, and we used the kind of like the hamburger standard that economists uses. We said, how much more is your salary than that of a teacher, a secondary school teacher in your town? And so they're above that, but not much above.
But if I'm Dietrich, not to fetishize my colleague,
Yes.
but if I'm Dietrich, I'm happy with that. Right?
Yes, so the leaders are indeed what he would have expected. But I think Dietrich's argument was that the popular support was also, not just the leaders. I'm not sure Dietrich actually talked about leaders and followers all that much, but I think he implied that the popular support was also, and so I think our findings suggest that that may not be entirely accurate in these cases. Yes?
So the question about some of the initial sort of attitude findings and associations with...
Would you like me to go back to this?
Yeah, that'd be great. So for example, you had an overall sort of, the average was people don't tend to associate human rights organizations with, for example, promoting foreign values and interests. But in terms of sort of how encouraged I am as like a human rights worker or whatever by that, I guess it would matter to me whether sort of, well, the average is pretty close to neutral, but okay, sort of for the most part, people aren't associating that, but it would matter to me whether 15% of people did associate
Yes.
with foreign values, or whether 40% of people associated with foreign values. Do you have any sense of kind of what that looked like?
I do have that sense. I don't have those numbers in front of me. I have to prepare, as you can imagine, you have to prepare this like a gazillion years in advance because it's so complicated. There is a hardcore in every country that thinks that. But obviously, because of these averages, that hardcore is not particularly strong. It's like 15%, 12%. So yes, every country has people who think that.
But it tends to be.
But it's much smaller than any of us expected. Much, much smaller. Much smaller than, reading the newspapers, you would think flipped, right? Nitsan.
I have 2 questions. the potential gap between the literature that you reviewed and your findings, because the literature, the way that you described it, is very much about what NGOs do, human rights NGOs do, rather than what the larger population thinks of them. And in order to be able to go back to that literature and criticize it or contribute to it, you have to assume that what the population thinks about NGOs is what these NGOs actually do, right? They're not actually agents of the US government
Right.
and so on. So it would be good to hear what you think about
That's a
our
very good
literature,
question.
yeah.
Yeah.
The other question is to go back to the most difference case selections.
Yes.
They are very different from each other, but they also seem to be very different from very many other countries. And Malawi, that you refer to, is a case in point, right? Is there a way to think, well, you know, India and Nigeria and Mexico are actually possibly in some regards, for example, attitude toward human rights, could be more similar to each other than it is to other countries in the region. So that, again, Malawi, the population attitude towards human rights in places, you know, particularly small or particularly poor or particularly whatever, will be actually different than the cases that you chose.
Okay, those are both really two excellent questions. I would expect nothing less of you. So for the first question, you're right that the early theorists conflated what HROs do and what people think of them. If you look back at Catherine's work or Kennedy's work, they don't make a strong distinction between this is what they do and this is what the population thinks. You have to kind of tease it out. They imply, if you read Catherine's work, she implies that large sections of the population support human rights groups. She never actually goes out and says that because there's no data on that. Similarly, Kennedy or Mutua and all those, they will say things like they are foreign to local people, they are from the cities and the rural people don't like them. England, for example, the anthropologist in Malawi, he said that the people who meet with human rights groups that he followed around hated them. But people don't systematically separate out what they do from what people think of them. But it's very much implied, the justification for what they're doing. I mean, Kennedy never says, human rights groups are colonial bastards, but the population loves them, so it's okay. He implies that the population kind of figures that out. So if you think that human rights groups are very different than what the population sees, then you have to say either they're super good at fooling the population, or the population has this false consciousness. Or you could just say, you know what, you can fool most of the people some of the time, but you can't fool all the people most of the time. It's not the way it works. So if people are thinking this, and I conclude from that maybe the human rights groups are not so bad, but I wouldn't want to say, I can't pronounce on what they actually do. I can only pronounce on the way people see them. Your second question, are these actually what are these representative of? And so it's a thorny problem. I forgot to mention that they all have the same scope conditions. They're all democratic or semi-democratic. They all have active civil societies that work on human rights issues, and they all have sufficient press freedom so that people can form opinions about those organizations. Morocco is a repressive place, but it's much more liberal than it was 20 years ago. And you can talk pretty freely about anything except the king or Western Sahara. Nigeria, the same way. India, for sure. Mexico, most things you can talk about. So these are places that the phenomenon we're studying, civil society and human rights groups, exist, and people can form opinions about them. None of these four countries are riven by the kind of nationalism that, say, Serbia, Israel, Russia has. Right? The state does not dominate them to such an extent that it's hard to separate out state and society. So I would say that Israel and Russia and Serbia certainly fall off this. And there's probably a number of other countries. Rwanda might fall off too, where the state is so strong and society is so intermingled with the state that we can't talk about the population forming opinions really independently of the state. So I would separate those out. They don't satisfy the scope conditions. North Korea doesn't satisfy the scope conditions either because you can't form opinions. Malawi versus Nigeria, I don't know. I need more money and then I'll find out. I agree, it's a good question. Patrick.
So I think this is terrific, but I still have one concern, and that's a possible conflation of human rights with rights discourse. Because I actually think they're quite distinct. So, for me, human rights does invoke Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, foreign organizations, and they have their local counterparts. But if I take a case like India, the rights discourse in India has an existence that's completely autonomous of the human rights discourse. So, the Right to Food Act, the Right
Yes.
to Work Act, the Right to Information Act, the labor movement, which has been using the rights discourse, the right to land,
Yes.
which in West Bengal and Kerala goes back 50 years. And I think of urban Mumbai and urban Delhi. In slums, everyone talks about rights, and it's the right to not be evicted.
Yeah.
And there's all sorts of local groups that no one's ever heard of, that aren't even registered, that do all sorts of work. So for me, in the popular imagination and discourse, increasingly the word rights is associated with sort of local movements, mobilizations, even democratization. You know, in Brazil, they used to call it the right to have rights.
Mhm.
So it's not clear to me that you're not measuring
That.
rights more generally, as opposed to this particular construction of rights associated with the international legal community, et cetera.
Well-
Either way, it's a fascinating set of findings.
Thank
but-
you. All I can tell you is what we asked, or what we told the survey companies to ask, and we hope that they did, and we tried to make sure they did. We asked them, we told them to ask people, in your opinion, how strongly do you associate this phrase, one of these phrases, with the term human rights? Manavidikare in Hindi, right? Isn't that how you pronounce it? And we had a translation into Hindi and Marathi and Gujarati. In Nigeria, we did it in English, in Pidgin, and in Yoruba, and in Hausa. In Mexico, we did it just in Spanish. God, that was easy. In Morocco, we did it in Darija Arabic, and we did it in French. And we had it in Berber, but we didn't have very many Berber respondents. So I don't know what they were thinking of. Maybe they were thinking of something else. But that's what we asked them. And then we asked them, when we asked the trust questions, that next battery, tell me how much trust you place in the following institutions, groups, or person. And we had a battery of 15, which we rotated so that it wasn't always the same order. And one of the questions was human rights organizations in your country. So if they were thinking about those groups, they probably were thinking about those groups, but that was the question. I think you would need focus groups and a different method to capture that nuance. But if that mattered so much, why does Mumbai kind of look like the other countries? Right? If there was a uniquely Mumbai approach that was completely different than the Nigerian, that was completely different than the Mexican, we wouldn't find these similarities. And the regression lines wouldn't be the same. Right? This is the pooled regression, controlling for country. But if you do the individual country regression lines, they operate in the same direction with more or less the same magnitude. So to me, what my survey colleagues tell me is if when you find that across countries, then you've got to conclude that people are more or less thinking of, it's evoking an association in their mind of the same thing. And there are particularities, but those particularities are not strong enough as to invalidate the cross-national. But all cross-national surveys suffer from this problem. That something, for example, we asked in Mexico, one of the questions we asked is how many light bulbs do you have in your home? Because that's a reliable measure in Mexico of how many of your socioeconomic status. Turns out that in Morocco, which is poorer than Mexico, people have tons of light bulbs in their homes because everybody uses a chandelier. So that's not a reliable measure. So there are things like that. But on our two main questions that I present here, we translate into the local language and we find similar things across countries. It's pretty amazing.
So fascinating. So human rights organizations is a very broad umbrella, I would think. And I would wonder if your results would vary if you looked at different types of human rights.
Yes.
So not just different types of human rights organizations, but different types of rights. So meaning if you were to look more at the right to foods of the world versus the right not to be tortured. And so here's why I think it might matter in a couple of different ways. One, the distinction between the local and the international that you talk about, you started the conversation with, would be fundamentally different. So in many ways we think, because you asked what is the nature of the relationship between the local NGO and the international NGO, and we don't really understand that. Well, one thing we understand about the link between the local and the international is that it usually hinges on information. So the provision of information from the local to the international is what serves as kind of that first step. But when you're dealing with socioeconomic rights, how many people are educated, how many people are fed, how many people have access to healthcare, we have statistics already on this. The information of the extent and scope of these problems are already known. And oftentimes in these spaces, regardless of what they will say, NGOs often love to say that they start with local partners. They don't. So they will start campaigns at the international context and they'll impose them locally, right? So the dynamic between the local and the international may be different. And the second is that the type of the work they're doing may be different, and that may affect levels of trust. So if you're talking about a social or economic right, so food, your Oxfams of the world are not just advocating, they are irrigating fields, which means that their involvement and interaction with the communities is of a different type than Amnesty or Human Rights Watch, which is mostly weeding, right? Or I imagine weeding. Marxists actually don't know what they do in the civil political realm, but and so that leads to two, I guess, questions. One being, did you look at the difference between different types of rights and advocacy, what we think about a human rights organization engaged in these different types of rights, and how the nature of different types of work may affect different types of trust? And one other, I guess, third thing would be, looks like most of the time you did surveys in urban areas. Is that correct?
Well, all our surveys have a rural oversample,
Okay,
and we control for urban, rural residents.
okay. Because
So
you
these are
may-
net
yeah.
of rural urban, and the rural urban did not, for the most part, did not come up as statistically significant in the larger models.
Oh, well, that may be a way of washing it out, because what you might find is in a lot of the more rural areas, you'll have more active activity with, for instance, rights
Yeah.
of food groups.
Yeah. Well, all I can tell you is that the statistics don't show that that matters. But let me ask you, your first question is a really good one. So let me talk about Israel, for example, which is a country I know well. There's been one survey of attitudes towards human rights groups in Israel, done, not an academic survey, done by an NGO consortium with a communication strategist. And they did 600 telephone interviews, and so the methodology was not like ours. And they found that people had trust in human rights organizations in general. That was not dissimilar from what we had, but when you ask them about human rights organizations working for Palestinian issues, that trust dropped. So we found that out a little bit late in the process. So in Nigeria, we tried to correct for that. We asked about a barrage of different types of human rights organizations. We said, how do you feel about human rights organizations working on general human rights? And how do you feel about organizations working on women's issues, gay and lesbian issues, da 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 da. We didn't find substantial differences.
Really?
Yes, and so that really surprised us and worried us. One possibility is that the general population in a place like Nigeria just doesn't really distinguish, just doesn't really care that much. And the population in Israel is very different, highly politicized, highly mobilized. Everybody serves in the army. People have strong feelings. Maybe the Nigerian population is just different in that respect. So that's one possibility. The other possibility is that our surveyors are bad, and they kind of garbled that one. A third possibility is that it's too hard a distinction for ordinary people to make. So we asked people, for example, what do they think about Amnesty International? We said, what do you think about international human rights groups? And what do you think about Amnesty International? And the rates of response for Amnesty International were about 47%. Whereas the rates for what do you think about international human rights groups in general, or human rights in groups in general, was up in the 80s or 90s. So what that indicated to us is that in some places, people are forming impressions about the category, but they're not informing so much. It's like asking about politicians. How do you feel about politicians? Oh, I hate them. How do you feel about the state senator in Idaho? I don't know who that is. I don't so we need to push that a lot more. And so in our next round of surveys, we're going to be much more diligent about trying to pursue looking for those differences. We haven't found them in Nigeria. Now, one could say that the associational measure is a way of doing that, right? What do you associate the words human rights with?
Except that begs the question, what do you mean when you say human rights, which may also...
No, it doesn't, because we say, how strongly do you associate this phrase with human rights? So we're actually trying to unpack what people's associations are with human rights. We're not making an assumption. We're making an assumption that people have at least 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 different associations. And so we're saying, which one of these 9 associations resonates with you? And this is what you see. And then when we run regressions in which the independent variable is these associations and the dependent variable is trust, they largely turn out as anticipated. If you think that human rights is about torture and murder, socioeconomic justice, and free and fair elections, you trust. And if you think it's about protecting terrorists, criminals, promoting U.S. interests or foreign values, you mistrust. That relationship makes sense. The only one that flips is women's rights. In India, if you think human rights is about protecting women's rights, you mistrust human rights groups. And in Morocco, the reverse. And in the 2 other countries, it wasn't statistically significant. Don't know what's going on there, but there's something, and so we're hoping to go back. We have several proposals. We have the OSF one, but we also have a big NSF proposal in which we hope to go back to India and do the national rather than Mumbai. So this is just I mean, no one has ever asked these questions before, and so we're just beginning to generate the science of polling in human rights. But I find this very exciting because we can begin to try and tease out some of these. Do people really distinguish between different types of rights? Do they distinguish between different types of organizations? I suspect that they don't distinguish between organizations. Because remember, when we asked them, can you name a human rights group, only 7% said, yes, I could. But I didn't show you the number when we said, OK, what is that human rights group? Only like 2% could do it. So I don't think people are yet really identifying individual brands. They're like, they know toothpaste, but they don't know Crest versus this versus this versus this, which makes total sense.
You thought of running it in the US?
Yes.
What people would say?
Yeah, that's in the NSF is a US sample. US is relatively cheap because you can do it on Qualtrics with a computer-based thing. Yeah.
I think this is like somewhat related to Michelle's point. So in follow-up surveys, and I'll talk about Nigeria since it's the country that I know, you can ask questions about violent groups, right? And to the extent that you think that, or that people would think that these groups are protecting or promoting rights in some way. So this idea that people wouldn't trust human rights organizations because they think they're protecting criminals or terrorists, so they would be distrustful or suspicious of them. Well, in Nigeria, so the vigilante group, the Bakassi Boys, they are perceived by the local population as promoting physical security when the cops and the state was not doing that. Groups in the Niger Delta who are advocating for socioeconomic justice and resource controls is another human rights issue, being, at least the rhetoric that was given out by these violent groups. In Lagos, the Oduo People's Congress, which was very much involved in the pro-democracy movement in 1994, following the annulled elections, and advocating for regional autonomy. And even Boko Haram in northeastern Nigeria also had this rhetoric of demands for rule of law and respect for human rights, and this
Yes.
rejection of a corrupt, democratic, secular state
Right.
that was not doing anything in terms of development for the people there. So this idea that the population would be opposed to human rights groups because they think they're protecting criminals and terrorists, at least in Nigeria, seems like an odd way, or not the right way to necessarily think about it, when a lot of violent groups have been viewed at one point or another as advocating for human rights, or some kind
Well,
of rights.
so I think you're right that each country has a number of specificities which would be fascinating to probe. And this, hence, you've stumbled on the perennial problem of cross-national research. On the one hand, anyone who knows Nigeria wants to know what people think about Boko Haram or the Bakassi Boys. However, that's not a meaningful question outside of Nigeria, right? So how do you ask that question in a way, if you're doing multiple countries, how do you ask a question that works across multiple countries that's comparable, but that also captures specific? It's very tricky to do. And so we've erred now, given limited resources, we've erred on the generic type of question rather than the specific. Rather than what do you think of this group or this party, we say, what do you think of human rights groups? Or we asked, what do you think of human rights groups working for the rights of groups that are fighting with the government? So that's one of the questions we did ask. And it doesn't capture the full richness of it because it doesn't use the name. And of course, all the human rights activists that we talk to always bring up the specifics because they care about the specifics. They don't care about the cross-national so much. So I think one of the things we have to do in future surveys is to try and incorporate more of those specifics. But then you can't run these cool regressions or comparisons because there's no Bakassi Boys anywhere else.
There might be like other, think of violent groups maybe in Mexico. I don't know if there's any human rights rhetoric that they
Rule of law
a
and
rule
the
of
right
law.
to, right
I mean,
to a
yeah, maybe
trial.
specific organizations. Yeah, you wouldn't want to ask about those, but I don't know. There might be some way to
Yes.
find.
My intuition that asking about specific groups yields very low. Every time we've asked about anything specific, we don't get very high response rates, which is interesting, but then you spend a lot of money to ask about something you're not going to get responses on, and then you can't analyze that. Once you start dropping below 70, 60, 50% response rates, you're like, can I use that? So you want to ask questions where you're hopeful that at least a significant portion of the society has an opinion. And so you're right. Probably if we kept it to Lagos, there were groups that we could ask because everybody will know this or that group. But once you do it nationally, it's a real challenge. So you're right. Country expertise, cross-national expertise, there's some real trade-offs there.
So I guess I wanted to push you a little further about how the initial literature that you cited from Simmons and Murdy and Hafner-Burton fits or connects with your findings. Because when you go back through that initial literature, the implications are that, you know, local acceptance or local access or local participation matters, depends, requires, or is required for.
That's what that kind of liberal literature suggests,
Right,
yes.
the liberal literature. So I'm wondering, like, if you are connecting your findings about trust in the local population, like, what does that, I mean, if you were gonna sharpen the connection to the literature, like, what would you say? Because it seems like all the liberal theories are at least pointing towards something more, they're pointing towards efficacy of the delivery of the human right in some way, or the normative realization of the human right.
So you're right. Again, I think this is very similar to Nisan's question, is that the literature does not focus specifically on public opinion versus groups versus efficacy. I think there's an assumption that groups that are efficacious tend to have at least some popular support.
So is the finding that the finding of trust in the local population means that actually efficacy is potentially viable since these NGOs
I think,
have
yes, the literature suggests that local support is a possibility in these countries and other countries like them. And this doesn't directly confirm or disconfirm the liberals, but it does point to the importance of the finding. The liberals say there will be no success unless there's local support from NGOs or from the public or both. It doesn't really specify. We find that the public is supportive of NGOs. That doesn't mean that the NGOs are making good use of that. That doesn't mean they're being efficacious. It does mean, though, that if you think that this is an important thing, then we have a piece of the puzzle. Right? So we don't directly confirm or disconfirm what the liberals say. The liberals just say this is important. Local NGOs are important. So I cite them to say they're important. And the critical theorists also say they're important, but they say they're negative, they're bad. So everybody agrees that, what I'm trying to say is everybody agrees that local NGOs are important, even though most IR theorists in particular don't study them rigorously. They use them to study international stuff. They say they either input to international stuff or they permit international stuff to happen or block international stuff, but they don't actually study them. That's more done by anthropologists and comparative political scientists.
And then if I could just ask a quick follow-up, like when you gave the spectrum, the different tiers of NGOs that you were speaking about, you said that you designed your research mainly in relationship to the tier 3 ones. And it seems that the tier 3 ones have what the liberals are citing might be important. It seems like there's something about the structure of the tier 3 NGOs that is picking up on what the liberal theory suggests is necessary.
I think the liberal theories are actually talking mostly about these groups. When we talked to human rights leaders, we selected them from this tier. But when we asked the population, we don't know which tier they were referring to. They could have been referring to any one of those tiers, and they probably were referring to the joint vector of everything these groups have done over the last 10 years.
Yeah, so when you surveyed, it could have been any, I mean, they could have been.
I don't know what they were thinking of. I asked them, what do you think about local human rights organizations? And I don't know. When I asked them, are you thinking about a particular one, I know they didn't have any particular one in mind. But they did have an opinion, which to me sounds normal. I mean, I have an opinion about stuff, but I don't know the specifics. Right? I have an opinion about free trade, but if you ask me, you know, what exactly is the tariff on shoes, I don't know.
Very interesting. It provokes two questions. One is, it's startling that these questions have never been asked before in human rights research. So I wonder if you have some thoughts about
Why that might be?
the absence of how late to the game human rights research is to this. And two, I was struck by, I'm trying to reconcile what you described as the conventional wisdom of the human rights organizations. They're hated. Go back, there's a slide where you basically list what, and your findings are completely opposite of what the actual human rights practitioners think. There's something that needs to be explained, because these are not armchair human rights people. These are people who are out in the field and have a lifetime of experience working in human rights organizations and dealing with the challenges of everyday nuts and bolts human rights stuff.
So why did they get it wrong?
Why did they get it so wrong? And I'm wondering, you know, you had a slide where only 8% of the population even recognized what, so maybe it's like, it's this vast, I wouldn't say apathetic, but kind of just not particularly aware of that is, you're capturing a lot of that. They're capturing
Yes.
a smaller number of intensely
Yes.
oppositional
Yes.
forces.
Yes.
And so is that?
Okay, yeah, so let me talk about both good questions. First of all, why are human rights people so late to the game of public polling? I can only hypothesize, but for any of you who are interested in human rights, you'll probably know that human rights has been dominated by lawyers. The study of human rights has been dominated by lawyers. It's only really in the last 7 to 10 years that social scientists have really gotten into it. And the social scientists who got into it most were anthropologists and IR scholars. Neither of them use public opinion polls. Anthropologists have done a lot of thick description of individual organizations, and IR people have talked about this big statistical finding about democracy and civil society. Opinion polling is mostly done in comparative politics and in American politics. And it's amazing. People just haven't put 2 and 2 together. And this is not the first time, it's the second time in my career that I put something. The first one was the Amnesty International counting of media. First time that anyone ever did it. Or the second time, actually. One person had done it before. And now everyone does it. Every time I mention these polls to Amanda Murdy and all these, they're like, great, yeah, let's go gather this data. But it didn't happen. And it only happened for me. I never thought of it. I literally thought that asking human rights leaders what the population thought of them was the best that had ever been done. And when I went and gave a talk at Minnesota, Catherine says, I applaud you, Catherine Zickick, for asking the residents question. It never occurred to me to do opinion polls until I was at this Mexican university, which happens to have a survey unit. And I'm having lunch with the survey guys, and I'm like, hey, we could accept those questions, couldn't we? And they're like, we never thought about that. Human rights is a big thing, isn't it? I'm like, yeah, it is, but I've never thought. It just never occurred to any of us. There's one survey done by worldopinion.org out of the University of Maryland where they asked this massive sample from around the world what they thought of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, what their positions. They didn't ask them the type of questions we asked, but they asked, do you think torturing people is good? Do you think torturing people is bad? And they found some pretty upbeat findings. And that's it. The World Values Survey for the last 10 years has asked, how do you think human rights conditions in your country are today? Are they bad, somewhat bad? That's the only question that's been asked. So I think these last 10 years have been a fruitful period for social science and human rights to come together. And it's an exciting time. The second question, I think you hit on the answer, which is human rights groups interact intensely with the people who care most about what they're doing. The state, journalists, opposition parliamentarians, politicians, who are organized and vocal. And so they're getting a lot of input from the people who care the most. And they don't know that the mass of the population has reasonably supportive views, but doesn't have any incentive to express it in any heavy means. It's a collective action issue. It's the silent majority issue. What it means, however, is that there's a latent possibility for reaching out. But the people who care most are it's an elite that makes its views very strongly known. Nina.
This follows a little bit on Peter's question. Did you have a question in the survey asking respondents what they thought the government's view of human rights was? And this seems to me interesting, especially going forward as you have this crackdown on NGOs. And we also know from public opinion polling, especially from survey experiments, that leadership, right? How is the public form its opinion, right? So statements from government officials and leaders can be very influential in shaping the public's view on various issues. So it seems, what's interesting here is, it seems to me there's a relationship to probe between what the public opinion is about human rights versus what the government thinks about human rights, and how resilient this is going to be in the face of governments who are, on a public opinion rampage against human rights groups. And so I was wondering, did you have a question about what do you think your government thinks about human rights?
That's a good question.
Interesting to track across time.
And I need to ask that question. We asked a very similar question, which is, what do you think human rights conditions are in your country today? And 56% said that they were either very bad or pretty bad. And we also asked, what political party do you support? And we then transformed those into the ruling political party. So we can play around with that, but we didn't ask precisely that question.
When you have Russia and Israel specifically saying, NGOs are
Yes.
foreign agents undermining the state, what's the public going to think about human rights?
That's a great,
after that?
and in fact, what that suggests to me is a survey experiment in which we say, The government says human rights organizations are bad. What do you think about human rights
And
groups?
then you said the government is very supportive of what you.
Yes.
Yep.
Thank you. You've just created a new article for me. And that will cost $10,000, so I'll be expecting a check in the mail.
A cut, please.
But that's a great question. That's brilliant. Thank you very much.
Hi, just a quick question about donors. So as you mentioned, these are very interesting results for donors, either to justify what they have been doing in supporting local organizations or to
Yes.
get support to do more. But I wonder if there's a tension, perhaps not in the countries that you've surveyed, but in other places where you talked about restrictions on donor funding.
Yeah.
On countries that are putting more and more restrictions because of counterterrorism
Yes.
issues, maybe not exactly related to human rights, local NGOs,
Right.
but also humanitarian assistance. And I'm just wondering if there's a tension in this donor, there could be in the donor discourse, because there are more restrictions, more demands on local NGOs for reporting and showing results and things like
Yes.
that, so.
So the donor part of the story is very interesting. Let me first tell you about some questions we asked. We asked the population, who do they think funds human rights organizations? Do you think it's the international organizations? Do you think it's foreign governments? Do you think it's foreign citizens? Do you think it's citizens of your own country or your own government? And overwhelmingly, people think that the funding comes from local sources. And they're entirely wrong. Right? It's just not true. So the public really doesn't know the situation of funding. But we also asked, do you trust groups? And then we tried to correlate, map the relationship between thinking that it comes from overseas and whether you trust groups or not controlling for all these other things. And to our enormous surprise, only in Morocco was thinking that the money came from overseas a bad thing. In India, which I know Patrick cares a lot about, if you think it comes from overseas, you trust the organizations more. If you think it comes from your own government, you don't trust the group. So foreign funding is less of a hot button issue for the population than I expected, even though it is the #1 issue for governments. So I found that utterly fascinating, because in Israel it is a hot button issue, and in Russia it is a hot button issue. And I expected that that would be fraught, and it's not as fraught. People don't seem to care as much. And then it reminded me of all those studies that show that when there was a French intervention in Mali, for example, the population was in favor of the intervention. All the post-colonial types were like, yet one more example of French intervention, but it turns out that the population was actually pretty pro-intervention because it was perceived as a better alternative to the government. So I find myself in somewhat of a neocon position on that, which I never intended. I wanted to be the lefty. But it turns out that at least in the countries we looked at, people seem to care less about the foreign element. Okay. I would hate, and when I talk to donors, I would say, I would hate for you to take away from this that you should start pouring more money into human rights organizations. I think the message is people think the money comes locally, people support these groups. I think you should help these groups develop the capacity to raise money locally. Not for you to, donors would always say, well, the reason we support them is because local people won't support them. And what I want to say is that's just not true. The reason why you support them is because it's convenient for you and convenient for the organizations. But in fact, my polls would suggest that there are opportunities for local fundraising that you have not explored. And so that's what I try, that's the message I try and say. And some donors are quite interested in that. Others less so.
We have run out of time.